in its downtown area. And so I hope that you will be able to find some time to see that. Lots of great restaurants and other places to visit around the hotel. And the city of Hattiesburg itself is quite a discovery. So I encourage you to spend a little extra time. Don't miss the sessions, but spend a little extra time maybe tomorrow afternoon getting around. So thank y'all for making those opportunities possible. I also want to recognize the staff, many of whom are scattered across the room, some of whom are behind the scenes and may not be in here with us right now, at Mississippi Department of Archives and History. If you are a staff member of MTAH, will you stand briefly and let us just recognize your contributions? If you weren't at the business meeting earlier, Brother made some really great remarks about the unique relationship that the Department of Archives and History has with the Mississippi Historical Society. And it truly is a symbiotic contribution, and it's hard sometimes for me to distinguish the staff role versus the Historical Society role, but both have benefited me personally quite a bit and professionally, and those contributions are visible in all of the arrangements that you have seen, as well as the books that you can buy, and the way that we have set up the program, and so I'm entirely grateful for all of that. In addition to me, the outgoing president, there are a number of former presidents who have joined us today. And so if you are a former president of the Mississippi Historical Society, if you could just stand up for a sec. I think we have 2 or 3 maybe in the room. I encourage you to check out that list of presidents, former presidents inside of your program. A lot of distinguished folks in there. Some of whom were historical subjects of mine. And so, it is an honor and a privilege to be in this position and to be one reminder of how much this group has meant to so many of us. I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague and friend, Rebecca Torrey, who is the chair of the Local Arrangements and Program Chair and also Associate Professor of History at USM. Great. So, Toby Barker, who is the mayor of Hattiesburg, I know you showed up just in time, is going to offer just some brief remarks to officially welcome you to Hattiesburg. And I will turn it over to him as soon as I'm just going to entertain y'all for a second while he makes his way up here. Mayor Barker, I want you to know, you may have missed my remarks, but I was just bragging on your city quite a bit and encouraging folks to stay a little past our program to explore the downtown area. And the Local Arrangements Committee has done quite a bit of work to open up some historical spaces for us so that we can learn a little bit more about the history of this place. Welcome. I'm going to turn the mic over to you.
Sorry I'm late. I was trying to meet my kids at the zoo for lunch, and they were really slow today with the chicken salad. So, but we're excited to have you here. Thank you for what you do. Part of what we do as I think as a society is learning from those who came before us and learning story, and telling that story to the next generation is so vitally important to give us context to guide us to take our next steps. We're especially glad to have you in Hattiesburg. We believe there's something for everyone, whether it's in our downtown or at our zoo or any of our 3 breweries. For the Baptists in the crowd, we have 3 Chick-fil-A's. For all the Episcopals and Methodists and Catholics, we have more bars per capita than the other cities. So I hope that you'll get out and enjoy all Hattiesburg has to offer. I hope that you'll also take a look at our budding public arts scene. We've got over 30 murals now around the city, and adding more. And just you've arrived at a really vibrant time in our city's history, and we're excited about not only the chapters where we came from, but also kind of the next chapters that are waiting to be written. And we're excited to have you here in Hattiesburg. Special thanks to Katie Blunt for all of her help in helping tell Hattiesburg's story and preserve that story. I'm sure all of you know about the Archives and History. Actually, I hope you don't know about the Archives and History grants because I want them all in Hattiesburg. But Katie and her team have been so incredible to work with in helping, whether it's school buildings or right now our Sanger Theater, It's such a vital resource, and I don't think people understand. I'm a recovering legislator. And I can't tell you how difficult it is to go and get money for something. But Katie is not only administering this money. She has to go and advocate with people who sometimes don't see the value in what you do. And Katie's been a very effective advocate, and I'm hoping that this year we get a big one because of all the money that's out there. So they have no excuse this year. So anyway, all right. Well, thank y'all for being here today. We're excited to have you, and hope you get around to see Hattiesburg. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Okay, so for real this time, Dr. Shuri, if you will come and welcome everybody and introduce our keynote for today.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Hattiesburg. I do want to just say two more thanks while I'm thinking of it. Thank you to Allison Neville and the Downtown Association of Hattiesburg for all that you've done to help welcome our guests today. And thank you also to my wonderful assistant, Jara Runnels. I see you back there with the camera, Jara. She helps me with the Gulf South Center here at USM, so I just wanted to say thank you to them as well. But on with our program. I am so honored today to have the opportunity to introduce Dr. Patricia Boyett, our keynote speaker for this opening plenary session at the Mississippi Historical Society meeting. Dr. Boyett is the director of the Women's Resource Center and a visiting assistant professor at Loyola University in New Orleans. She received her PhD in history in 2011 from this wonderful institution, the University of Southern Mississippi, where she wrote an over 1,000-page dissertation on the history of race and justice in Mississippi's central piney woods. It had almost 100 interviews in that dissertation. Her dissertation won the Mississippi Historical Society's prize for best dissertation in 2012. In 2015, she then published Right to Revolt, The Crusade for Racial Justice in Mississippi's Central Piney Woods with the University of Mississippi Press. That book, which you can buy in the back after her presentation, and she will sign it for you too. That book won the Eudora Welty Prize in 2016, and that is for the best book written that was published with the University of Mississippi Press in that year. She also wrote an article on Paul B. Johnson for the Journal of Mississippi History for its Spring-Summer 2019 volume. Boyett joined the faculty at Loyola in 2013, and since then she has won a slew of teaching and service awards, including an Outstanding Faculty Award and the Ignatian Faculty Fellow. She was the winner of the Community Partner of the Year Award from the City of New Orleans in 2017. Prior to pursuing her PhD, Boyett received her Master's in History from USM in 2002, writing about the trials surrounding Vernon Dahmer's murder. A BA in History from Mississippi Valley State in 2000, and before that, she also had a BFA in Theater from Arizona State in 1992. Currently, she's working on a manuscript, After the Revolt, which examines the struggle for racial justice that has persisted in the Piney Woods long after the height of the Civil Rights Movement. Won't you please join me in welcoming Dr. Boyett.
Well, thank you so much. Am I shorter than everybody else? Can you all hear me okay? Okay, so thank you so much, Dr. First, for such a nice introduction to University of Southern Mississippi for having me. It was such a great joy to be in school here and to see some of my fellow graduate students like Christian that you're going to hear from later, and Ryan and Jim, and some professors I was lucky to study with. I also want to thank the Mississippi Historical Society for having me, Mr. Rogers, and of course Stephanie Earl there. It's just an absolute privilege to be back at my alma mater, and also to be in this phenomenal city of Hattiesburg, which I had the great joy and privilege of meeting so many amazing freedom fighters here, who created what I argue was one of the most powerful civil rights movements in America, and now that I teach comparative history of oppression and resistance around the world, I really think it's a model and one of the most powerful social justice movements I've ever studied. And that's the heart of my talk today, is about the struggle. And one of my great challenges was trying to shorten the talk, because clearly I have a problem with editing if I had 1,000-page dissertation. And also, but it's really because there's just so many amazing people here that were involved in the movement. It's just hard to quickly run through it, but I will do my best. One of the things one of the reasons I make that argument about which I was so interesting, I found so interesting about Hattiesburg, is when I was first reading about it. In other books, you'd find a snippet here or there, and it was mostly portrayed as a more moderate city and a state and a region that otherwise was notorious for racial oppression. But when I started researching it, I did find there were moderates here and progressives that were white people that were interested in helping the movement. But I also found a really tragic history here. In many ways, the story of Hattiesburg was, a tragedy of a deep South community that was racked by mob lynchings and police brutality and Klan terrorism and malicious prosecutions. But there's a whole other side of that story too, where it's really a story of hope and redemption and empowerment, because there was just this phenomenal community of African Americans that were so brave and bold and that worked so hard together to create the foundations for a phenomenal movement, and then drew white moderates and white progressives into that movement. So that's what I'm here to talk about today, and one of the reasons I also, just before I get to some of these slides, to talk about why I see it as one of the most powerful movements, because clearly we know so much, right, about Selma and Birmingham and all these other places, and Greenwood. But right here in Hattiesburg, there's so much of the foundation of what everybody else did. And a lot of that started with politics, with the vote. Vernon Dahmer, who I'll talk a lot about today, saw the vote as the most important element, because without political power, it's hard to get anything else done. And so he moved also. The movement also moves from the vote to equal representation, because it's one thing to have suffrage, it's another to be able to elect representatives that will have your voice on the stage. The other part is you also see in the foundation of this movement move from desegregation to integration. And Clyde Kennard is somebody also talked about today that really pointed out that if you don't have integration, separate was never equal, right? And if you can't fully integrate, then African Americans couldn't have access to all the institutions in which they could move up and gain power in society. And they will anyway, actually, which is also phenomenal, is what they will do with all the challenges and obstacles that they did face, but that you needed to get full integration. And then justice, right? Justice in the courthouse, but also in the streets against police brutality and against malicious prosecutions, and when Klan terrorism or mob lynchings happen, to get justice, right? And then finally, socioeconomic equality, to be fully integrated. It's one thing to pass laws, but then also to change culture so that there isn't more covert forms of bias. And all of that was present right here in Hattiesburg and laid the foundation for so much else. And so one of the foundations of suffrage and the voting rights was the Lind case, United States versus Theron Lind. Theron Lind was a registrar here, and before him was Harold Cox, and both of them made it part of their mission to not let any African Americans register to vote. In fact, Harold Cox became famous for asking that there was then a literacy exam to register to vote. And it didn't really matter how well you did on that exam if you were an African American. They were going to try to fail almost all of them, right? And it also didn't matter if, for white people, if they were doing wonderfully on the exam or if they were illiterate and couldn't even sign their name because they'd fill out the application for them, right? So Harold Cox actually became famous for asking a question, how many bubbles are in a bar of soap, which clearly nobody can answer, right? So that was the kind of resistance they were facing just to get suffrage, which is a constitutional right they had with the 15th and the 19th Amendment. So Vernon Dahmer was one of the most important people, and also who I pictured there, Earlene Boyd and her husband Richard Boyd, who founded the first Forest County branch of the NAACP down here. And we're also part of a really, I think, and we could talk about more of this in the Q&A if you want, but I think one of the reasons that Hattiesburg had such a powerful movement is because you had African Americans of the middle class and the working class and the upper class that were willing to take risks, where sometimes in other places they weren't taking as many risks as they were here. For example, Vernon Damer owned a 200-acre farm. He was also this great entrepreneur, and he built a gas station there, a store, a mill, and many other things. Richard Boyett started out as a laborer, but he worked, because of civil rights, through the civil rights work and union work up into management, right? And so you had this sturdy black middle class and some African Americans moving into the upper class and working class working together. And so they created their first, as I mentioned, branch of the Forest County NAACP. Vernon Damer was one of the presidents of that. And that was a revolutionary act at the time. And so they had to meet secretly at Vernon Damer's farm. And they brought a lot of other important people into the movement. And then they tried to launch a voting rights case first against Harold Cox, and then were more successful with Theron Lind. And the Department of Justice got involved in that. And it was actually fairly easy to prove that there was discrimination because they kept all these records, and you could see where they failed African Americans that should have passed the exam, and where they're passing whites that shouldn't have. And so they had that, and they actually won early on cases, but Theron Lind kept appealing. So it kept, they had to keep it kind of going. Another really important person in the movement was Clyde Kennard. He was also part of the Forest County NAACP. He was a veteran. He was from Kelly Settlement, and he was getting his degree at the University of Chicago, but his stepfather fell ill, so he came home to help with the farm. He had 1 year of school left, and it would make most sense to come to this university, which was then Mississippi Southern College. But it was segregated, right? And historically, black colleges were too far away for him to commute. So he's at University of Chicago, which is a phenomenal school, and he had a phenomenal record. So there was no reason other than his race that he wasn't permitted to go here. So he decided, both because he wanted to finish his education and he wanted to advance civil rights, that he would apply. And that was an extraordinarily dangerous act, right? He met with the president then, William D. McCain. And while William D. McCain was very civil in person to him, behind the scenes, he was conspiring with the Citizens Council, the Sovereignty Commission, with the governor at the time to figure out how to keep him out of this university. And so there was even a suggestion by a citizen council member, white citizens council member, that they should have him killed. And they can make it look like an accident by putting him on the railroad. But they decided, and this is where I think Hattiesburg started to get its reputation of being more moderate, what they decided was they understood that violence would bring in media, investigations, federal intervention. So they wanted to find a way to prevent him from going to Southern Miss without attracting that attention. So they conspired to falsely accuse him first of bootlegging, but that was only a misdemeanor, and then they framed him for stealing chicken feed and sent him to Parchman for 6 to 7 years. And when he was in Parchman prison, Vernon Damer and other activists were constantly working, hired lawyers and so forth, the NAACP did, to try to get him free, particularly as he contracted cancer, stomach cancer, and he was denied treatment for so long that it became a deadly disease for him. And he will ultimately, because there's a huge Free Clyde Kennard campaign that's led by Mississippi Free Press, but also Vernon Damer and Dory and Joyce Ladner, who were members of the youth NAACP here, got massive attention. Dick Gregory and other celebrities came in. He was released, but it was too late, and he will die of stomach cancer. He is eventually exonerated posthumously. But through this time, while that was all happening, Vernon Damer kept trying to, and Early Boyd and many other people, I don't have time to name because there's so many, but they were trying to work to build on the Lind case and to build a really powerful civil rights movement here. And Damer thought the legal avenue was really important, but it's slow, right? Especially because of all these appeals. And so he saw what was happening, in other parts of Mississippi and all over the South, and he wanted more action to happen here to bring attention. So he reached out to Bob Moses of SNCC, who was trying to get a beachhead of the movement in Macomb, and had recruited 2 young people there, Hollis Watkins and Curtis Hayes. And Vernon Damer asked, could you send somebody here? Could you help me build a beachhead here? I can put them up in my home and so forth, and I can introduce them to everyone I know. And Bob Moses thought this was a great idea because the Lynn case is right here, right? And you could see more and more people joining the NAACP and willing to take risks. So he sent them here. And immediately, Damer introduced him to so many people. Literally, I had like 20 slides of this before of all amazing people, but I had to shorten it to a few. But Reverend L.P. Ponder opened his church for them to come speak at. The woman, Lennon Woods, there was one of the people that attended, as was Victoria Jackson Gray. Lennon Woods immediately offers the first floor hotel for the COFO office. Victoria Jackson is one of the first people to raise her hand when they say we need people to go down to the courthouse to register to vote so we can keep this record of violation of your constitutional rights. And J.C. Fairley later becomes involved. They start bringing national civil rights leaders and ministers who really believe in the social gospel of Christianity and about equality for all people. And he will house them and give them an office. And so people are it's frantic stuff happening. People are really getting involved. Early Boyd stays involved. Marie Blaylock is another woman that gets involved. And the youth gets involved too. Doug Smith was just a teenager at the time, and he quickly becomes a youth project director. They bring in Sandy Lee Snick, who is the overall project director of Hattiesburg, and works with Doug Smith, who eventually becomes the project director. I mean, this is how fast it's moving, and these young people are so brave and bold and brilliant, and they're starting to really figure out how to, move things faster, not just wait all the time for the courts. So one of the things they do is they develop the Freedom Vote. And so with the Freedom Vote, it's basically a parallel unofficial election in which they get African Americans to register with them and then go through all the processes that you would go through in the regular election process, and then vote for, and then people run, COFO members ran as candidates with civil rights platforms, right? And so, but what they're trying to show is if people could register, if African Americans could register, they would, right? And they also bring in from Yale some white students, because it's not just Mississippi that suffers from racism, it's this entire country that was suffering from racism. And they knew the media would follow white people, unfortunately, more than they would follow African Americans, right? And privileged white people. And so the Yale students came in and they got people to go out and register to vote, and Hattiesburg again tried to make sure there wasn't public violence, so they put the police out in force. They had them arrested on minor traffic violations and so forth, and then they just kind of waited it out until they left, right? But they are succeeding in getting people to register, and they're building their case. Then they planned this, Freedom Day, which is one of the most important days, I think, in the civil rights movement across the country. Because what it is they decide, okay, every day we're going down to the courthouse with 5 or 6 people. What if we do a huge day that'll attract that media attention? And we get protesters, we've got national civil rights leaders that will come, the ministers that are here, and more will come. And they protest outside, and then get the students to participate, right? And because they can't vote, but they can be out there, they're not old enough to vote, but they can be out there with their signs. And then encourage as many local African Americans that are old enough to vote to get in line and register to vote. And they're going to call this Freedom Day, and they plan for it to be one day. Well, the Hattiesburg City Fathers are getting together to figure out how they're going to resist this. Again, they don't want violence because they don't want to bring in the federal government. So they make a plan to use intimidation. They're going to send the police out and look like a platoon coming out to try to scare people off. But they're going to tell them, don't use any violence, arrest anyone that makes a minor traffic violation or steps out of line where they're supposed to be in the barricades where the protest can happen, but do this nonviolently. And then the Citizens Council is there spying on them. The Sovereignty Commission is spying on them. They're collecting names, taking photographs, sending it to employers and landowners so that they can evict them, use economic intimidation against them. So there's a fear among the core that maybe nobody's going to show up. And then worse, it rains that day, right? But as you can see, they show up, right? They put scarves over their heads, they get their umbrellas up, and they line up at that courthouse, and they just keep coming all day long. And there's so many people, students come out, and they protest, and they stand out there, that it's just a phenomenal success. And there's so many people I want to mention, but Jamel Stokes, I got to mention her, because she was 15 years old at the time, And she comes out and protests, and she's going to get really involved in the movement. And Daisy Harris Wade, she had 3 young sons. She had opened her house to some ministers who had come. She showed up that day, but she's nervous, right? Because this could get you killed, right? This was a dangerous act. And so she stands across the street, and she's looking at all these brave young kids. She's looking at some of these national civil rights activists and the ministers and other people that are protesting there. And Jamela Stokes is looking at her, and Jamela Stokes, I had the privilege of interviewing her, said she was at first really frustrated watching adults across the street. She's like, come over here. You know, and the national civil rights leader was saying, but of course when you're young, you have that sense of invincibility. And Daisy Harris Wade had lived long enough in Mississippi to know how dangerous this was. And, you know, try to think about her children and everything. But she decides that it's time. She crosses that street with great courage and becomes one of the most important leaders in the movement here. And this is what they did face. This is also what she saw, the police. They came out marching down the street as if they were military, as if they were soldiers, right? But they did arrest people that day, but non-violently, right? In the courthouse, what they had planned for Theron Lynn to do, register people as slow as he possibly could, right? Because his hope was that if they just get tired of waiting out there, they'll go away, particularly because of the rain. And then he also, you know, put on the Southern charm and tried to charm the media and all that, and act like, oh, I'm doing my job, you know, I'm being fair, and we're following the law, and we'll follow all the procedures. Behind the scenes, there is violence. So some of the people they arrested, and sometimes they'll focus on actually arresting white people to try to get them to leave the movement. One of them was Oscar Chase, and he was a volunteer that came down here, and what they did with him, they arrested him nonviolently, but then they put him in jail. They put him in with an intoxicated inmate who was a rabid white supremacist and hated the civil rights workers, and they said, guess who this guy is? He's down here, he's, you know, with the civil rights movement, and they're always trying to red bait the movement, so he's a commie, you know, all that kind of stuff. And then they walked away, and they allowed that inmate to beat up Oscar Chase brutally, and then they gave the inmate cigarettes, right? But this is behind the scenes, no media, right? But the national civil rights leaders, you know, and the local civil rights leaders, like, we have to get this story out. So they photograph them. They also, you know, file a complaint, a civil rights complaint, and the story does get out. But what is really hard, always in Hattiesburg, is this, you know, if we want to talk earlier about what's going on in Hattiesburg, it was once known as a town of lynchings. But in this era, they're trying to always make it look like, no, it's moderate, we're civil here. So they're always having to fight against that and, you know, try to get what's going on behind the scenes out to the public too. Freedom Day, though, is so successful that they decided to make it Freedom Months. And they just come out day after day after day, protesting, lining up to register to vote, right? So a Forest County legislature tries to pass a law, and actually is successful in passing a law, that really prevents picketing around the courthouse, which is just a total violation of First Amendment rights, right? But he's able to do that. But one of the things that amazes me about Hattiesburg, no matter what obstacle they face, they find a way to overcome it, right? And so they start planning in Hattiesburg, it actually is proposed in Hattiesburg, a national SNCC meeting, that they have Operation Freedom Summer. So they're going to use some tactics already. They already have practice, like bringing in students, right? So for Freedom Summer, they're going to do a mass freedom vote. They're going to bring in students for the whole summer from predominantly white students, but they'll bring in African-American students too. Mainly the reason they're trying to bring in white students again is because of the racism of the whole country, and they know the cameras will follow white people. And from privileged backgrounds that might have access, you know, to federal officials and so forth, and media. And they'll also do freedom schools, which I'll talk about. White supremacists are also planning for Freedom Summer when they hear about it. Sam Bowers, who was in a Klan, he was a Mississippi chapter of a Louisiana Klan, decides to form his own, called the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, and it becomes one of the most violent clans in the history of America. And he is determined to use intense violence because he sees Freedom Summer as the battle, he'll call it, in the racial war in America. And he plans all kinds of bombings and harassment and murder in response to Freedom Summer. Governor Paul B. Johnson, though he is he uses less rabidly racial vocabulary when he talks about race in public, he is very much the same as Ross Barnett. He is a staunch segregationist, and he is determined to sustain Jim Crow in Mississippi. but he'll take a page from the Hattiesburg City Fathers, and he'll try to prevent violence in Mississippi as much as he can, at least publicly, because he knows that brings in federal intervention. So he literally models what they do on the state scene after what the City Fathers did on the city scene, and he calls it police freedom of movement. He tells officers, arrest people non-violently, get those Sovereignty Commission officials out there and Citizens Council spying, use economic intimidation behind the scenes. But of course, we now know that a lot of this stuff was also passed on to the Klan, the intelligence they got, and then they were targeting African Americans. When the volunteers started arriving in June, and I know it's very well known, the Neshoba case where immediately 3 civil rights workers go missing up in Neshoba County, and they didn't know it at the time, but they had been murdered by the Klan, right? An African American, as well as 2 white volunteers that came down. But Klan violence, they're trying to kill them everywhere, right? And as soon as the civil rights, the volunteers arrive, they're shooting at their cars, they're harassing them, they're beating up people. And they're arriving all summer. One group arrives on 4th of July, actually. And 2 days earlier, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 had finally been passed and signed by President Lyndon Baines Johnson. And in a newspaper here, and newspapers all across Mississippi, a lot of white journalists are, raging against that and saying, don't celebrate the 4th of July in protest. And in some of the volunteers in their interviews, they talk about how shocked they were when they came down here that African Americans were celebrating 4th of July and white people weren't. And African Americans hadn't, been fully included in independence, right? But they are the ones, they are celebrating it in many ways because they're fighting to force America to live up to its creed of justice and equality and liberty for all people. And Vernon Dahmer always had a big picnic at his farm every year, and then this year he's including these civil rights activists. So it's just really eye-opening for people coming from everywhere. And they are so moved about how welcomed they are into the African American community and this beloved community, and that it makes them feel braver because they're nervous when they get here, right? But also think about, they're going to be here for a couple months and most of them are going to leave. So they have to be brave for a couple months. Everybody else has to be brave that lives here, continue to be brave. Freedom School is just a phenomenal development, I think. Is what they planned was, in a lot of Mississippi schools, now certainly some African American teachers broke these rules, but in the curriculum, which was designed by white school boards, you weren't supposed to talk about Reconstruction, and you weren't supposed to talk about the Harlem Renaissance or the Garveyism or African empires. You weren't supposed to talk about anything that dismantled this myth of white supremacy, right? So freedom schools were designed as the inverse. Let's talk about all these things. And so they were hoping, what they hoped is to hold these summer schools and that maybe 600 students would show up in the state. First day in Hattiesburg, more than 600 students showed up in Hattiesburg. It became the mecca of the freedom school movement. And it was just a phenomenal movement. They often talk about moving them from Jim Crow children to freedom children to live in a new world. And in the basements and attics of churches that open up for freedom school, which also they were taking great risks, right? Churches were getting bombed for doing things like that. These young students were having knowledge open to them that they've been barred from obtaining for so long. And they will also bring in activists Daisy Harris will come talk about how to get involved in the movement or how to get your parents involved in the movement, right? How to get people to register to vote. You had musicians, famous musicians come down here and teach about music, but also, that if a celebrity comes, that brings media, so that was important. And then also, I just think it's so amazing how many African American girls got involved too, because what you'll find is, African Americans not only started amazing racial movements in this country, but they started the feminist movements always, the first one, and the second one, the third one, and the fourth one, right? And a lot of black girls will get involved and learn to, stand up and say what they want too. They'll get involved in the freedom press, and they'll get involved in leading discussions at a time when girls were always told to be quiet and let boys talk, right? And they were challenging all that. And Jamela Stokes, I have to come back to her again because she was just this amazing student, and one of the things that a lot of the activists started doing was, with the Civil Rights Act of '64 that passed, had many provisions in it, but one of them was that desegregation of public accommodations was unconstitutional. Well, it's one thing to have a piece of law, right? But if nobody follows it, it's just paper. And so they want to challenge that. And so lots of people started doing sit-ins, and mostly at restaurants, right? And at food counters and so forth. But Jamela Stokes said, okay, that's great. We absolutely should be there. But I'm not going to learn something sitting next to a white person at a lunch counter. What I want to go to is a library, where I'm not allowed to go. They have all these books, and it's gatekeepers that keep all African American children out of there. And so she said to her teacher, Sandra Addix, a white teacher volunteer in Freedom Summer, let's go there. And Sandra Addix loved the idea, and they got a bunch of their classmates, and they went to the library. And they were told they had to leave, but they refused. They did a sit-in, and they stayed there until the police were called, and the police made them leave. But people kept coming back day after day, and then they closed the public library. So, which is just illogical, really, right? But one of the things, it's always coming back to that. And one thing that when Kennard was launching his campaign, he wrote all these beautiful op-eds in the Hattiesburg American, and one of them talked about segregation. And he said, if black and white kids, we go through school and then we graduate. So in this separate but equal world, are there two separate legislatures? Are there two separate courthouses? Are there two separate governors? No. So it's separate but unequal, right? And there's not libraries and things like that for African Americans. And Jamela Stokes, and they keep, his work going. The Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party was one of the most brilliant initiatives I've ever read about it, and all the things I've studied, because they had that freedom vote. And now they say, let's develop a whole party, a Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, that will parallel the Democratic Party, and follow every law to a T in elections. And then also, 1964 is a presidential election year, so you're about to have the National Democratic Convention in Atlantic City. And they said, let's see if we can elect delegates from the MFDP. We'll also try to participate in the regular Democratic precincts and everything. And we'll keep record of when they violate our rights. Well, they kept record of that. They got all these people to participate to elect delegates, and they elect Victoria Jackson Gray, for example, as one of the delegates. And they go to Atlantic City, and they demand to be seated instead, because they followed the constitutional laws, where the regular Democrats did not. However, President Johnson is afraid he's going to lose the South if he unseats the Mississippi regulars, and so he forces the Credentials Committee that really was in favor of unseating the regulars to do a compromise and offer 2 seats. So it's very frustrating to many civil rights activists, but it is a victory. It's not the victory they wanted, but it is a step forward. And they continue to build the MFDP until in 1968 they do unseat those delegates, right? There are a lot of Klan attacks, and a lot of them all through history had focused on killing African Americans, right? James Chaney being one of them in Neshoba County, and he got a lot less media attention. They didn't even put his name, but they talked about Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner. But when they attacked whites, they got attention, right? And the movement got attention. So, for example, Rabbi Lelyfield was down here as a volunteer. He and David Owens, also a volunteer, and Lawrence Spears were attacked while they were canvassing for the MFDP. They were attacked by Klansmen with baseball bats that brutally beat them, and those pictures went all over. But often pictures of African Americans who were brutalized equally, I can't even find them sometimes, even though I know that happened in Hattiesburg. How they got through this, right? Because you wonder, how do you get through this? How do you every day get up and continue on despite the terrorism you're facing? Daisy Harris, Wade, and also a person who was 11 years old, Lily Jackson at the time, talked about going to these mass meetings, and that's what kept them going anyways, because they would get together in the church, they would sing social gospel songs like We Shall Overcome, they would get up and talk about what they were doing in the movement and what they wanted to do. And Lily Jackson, I remember her saying, it just stuck with me, she's like, it meant so much to me to see African Americans getting up and saying what we want, what we're going to do, right? And white people supporting us and that were at those meetings. And then Daisy Harris talked about when everybody, you could be terrified, but when everybody crossed their arms like they did, like that, held hands and sang, that the fear was gone, and that got you to the next day. The MFD, they did a big MFDP challenge also to try to unseat Congress in 1965. And they actually testified in Jackson, Mississippi. They had Civil Rights Commission hearings But Governor Paul Johnson comes back with, his Mississippi story and tries to refute all their evidence. In the meantime, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 does pass, and so when they go to Washington to unseat the regulars, there's still, there's just far too many whites that are not on board at this point, and say, well, okay, let's not move too fast here, right? Let's not unseat them. We've got the Voting Rights Act now, and so that will resolve a lot of problems you're all talking about. So they don't seat them. But they still, they continue to be a really important party, and like I said, in '68, they do unseat the delegates. And then this university right here, University of Southern Mississippi, finally desegregates with two brave women, Ray Lonnie Branch and Elaine Armstrong. When I was studying here, one of the things I think is so phenomenal, I was speaking to some of the librarians, I think Jennifer might be here, but and helped me so much with my research. But I remember them telling me, Bob Tusa, when she was here, made it such an effort to get an absolutely amazing civil rights collection here, to really change Southern Miss. And it does have one of the best collections. That and NDAH, I was just in debt to you for a lot of the research I was able to find, and really, made great changes at Southern Miss. What continued to happen though? So if you're looking at 65, you have civil rights bills I haven't even talked about, 57 and 60. You have Brown versus Board of Education. You got U.S. versus Thayer and Lynn. You got 1964 Civil Rights Act, 1965 Voting Rights Act. And it's still Jim Crow. It's still Jim Crow in reality here, right? They're barely desegregating schools or slow walking that with, appeals. It's still hard to get, sit down in a restaurant and get service. To the point, Peggy Jean Connor, another really important civil rights activist here, she decides, okay, y'all didn't serve me, guess what, I'm going to sue you. And she wins, eventually. But it's still the same in many ways. Things haven't changed yet. And a report comes out from the Civil Rights Commission that says one of the reasons that hasn't changed is there is a lot of violence happening in Mississippi. So there's tons of Klan terrorism, and there's police brutality, and there's malicious prosecutions, and there's slow walking every appeal that the white city fathers of any city or state will make. And so they warn that this needs to be changed, right? And they warn the violence is going to get much worse. It is in this era where Vernon Damer, he keeps seeing the vote. Okay, we got to get suffrage, but we also got to get black representatives, right? And trying to get more and more people to register to vote. You still have to pay poll taxes on a state level here. And that can be really intimidating to go down to the courthouse and do that. So he gets a deal that he can collect poll taxes out of his store, and he's also about to launch a voter registration campaign. And he publicizes this on the radio so people can know where to pay their poll taxes. He has long gotten threats from the Ku Klux Klan, constantly. People driving by casing his property and leaving signs and harassing him. But it stops in late October of '65. He and his wife Ellie, they had been staying up nights in shifts with shotguns across their lap, right? So in case the Klan came, like it was drive-by shooting so many other African American homes. But they thought, the danger had passed. What they hadn't realized, because they had gotten threatening phone calls, was the harassment had stopped because they started planning on how they were going to kill him. And the Forest County Clavern asked for Damer to be murdered, and Bowers agreed and then assigned it to a Jones County Clavern. So on January 6, 1966, in the early morning hours, 2 carloads of Klansmen, led by Cecil Sessom from Jones County, arrived at the Damer property, and it's the first time Ellie Damer and Vernon Damer went to bed and didn't sit up and watch that night. In that moment, that's when they attack, and they shoot in that house, and they throw Molotov cocktails into their home. They had 8 kids. 4 of them are in the U.S. military, fighting for this country, right? 1 just got out of the U.S. military's home, and they had 2 young children, Dennis and Betty, who were 12 and 10. And so Ellie quickly gets up to try to get her children out of the house, and a window gets stuck, so she's having trouble getting out, and Vernon Damer shoots back at the Klan. They finally all get out, but not before Betty's badly burned, and Vernon Damer's really terribly burned and has suffered from mass smoke inhalation. In the hospital, J.C. Fairley comes to see him, and he says, I know I'm dying, but it's worth dying for, and you got to keep up with the fight. And so they do. Sam Bowers made a terrible mistake when he did this, for many reasons. Vernon Dahmer was beloved by many people in Hattiesburg, certainly by African Americans, but also by many whites. Some that were even segregationists loved Vernon Dahmer and respected Vernon Dahmer. And he also worked with the Department of Justice on the Lynn case. He knew FBI Special Agent in charge, who was furious when he heard about his death and ordered the war that they were having against the Klan after the Show case into Jones and Forest County. And excuse my language, but he said, quote, "Get the bastards who did this," unquote. And so they will launch, this is a picture of the Dahmer home burned to the ground. But the Klansmen were not particularly intelligent, and they had left a lot of evidence at the scene. And so they were going to be able to build a really strong case against them. What he also didn't count on, he kept thinking that Klan terrorism would force black people into submission. It doesn't. It does the opposite. The African American community, I remember Daisy Harris Wade telling me, it was rage, and they just went out into the community in massive protest, and they took that protest and that anger, and it became this resolve that nobody could break. And they were going to get that. They were going to get political representation. They were going to get everything that Dahmer was fighting for. And as you notice, they're carrying the flag, right? And so again, I'm always, when I'm studying the movement, I'm always just amazed about how much they're living up to the creed of America that didn't fully include them, when the people they're fighting against, and who were included, were not living up to that creed. The police come out to monitor the protest, and a carload of whites comes in and tries to plow into the crowd. The police don't go after that car. Instead, they arrest an African American and claim he was intoxicated and being disorderly. J.C. Fairley is furious, and he actually confronts right there Chief Herring about that. And then they continue their march onto the steps, where they put forth some of the most comprehensive demands to be fully included in American society. That first, of course, get justice for Dahmer. They better do that, state and federal level, right? They say you've got to start making sure that the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, the Brown versus Board of Education is followed here in Mississippi. But they go further than that. They say, until we have equal representation, we're never going to get freedom. Especially the buses, mostly African-American business. You need to hire African-Americans. And police brutality has to stop. There's a whole bunch of cases I could talk about that, but I don't have time. They say we want African-Americans fully integrated into the police force and have equal power in the police force. So they protest night after night. They bring in state and national leaders like Charles Evers. And then finally the city fathers said, yes, we will work with you. And they start going in, from the streets to the boardrooms. And they wait, and they're patient. In 1967, nothing's happened, right? And so they launch huge protests again, and this time they boycott the buses, and they boycott downtown stores. And they are amazed that actually the day they boycott the buses, not a single African American is on that bus. And they're 90% of the customer base, right? And they're able to keep that up. But at this point, you're talking 1967, where a lot of people are really frustrated with how long it's taking to make this movement, work, like everything to work and make changes. And some are more moved by the Black Panther Party for self-defense, and maybe it's time to take up arms and at least defend ourselves. So there was a group called the Spirit that formed, and that happened in the wake of Dahmer's murder, and they at first started protecting, with guns, like armed guards, protecting civil rights leaders. But they're also moving sometimes during this protest. They'll have protests on the streets, using someone, so like when white Klansmen go by their meetings, and sometimes they'll shoot at the cars, right? They're still facing all kinds of violence from Klansmen. And so, but what's really hard, a new leader, he was always involved in NAACP, but the new president, Dr. C.E. Smith of the NAACP, was really struggling with this because he knew that if there's any violence from African Americans, that it was so easy for the white city fathers to try to paint the whole movement as violent and, and try to destroy it. At the same time, he understood, what a lot of young people were going through. So there's a lot of divides at time with the movement, trying to decide the best strategy forward. And ultimately, they ask all the demands to be implemented. they only really get the bus drivers and they get hiring in downtown stores, and then they end the boycott. And there were a lot of African Americans who were frustrated by that because they wanted to keep the boycott going. And there was, Dr. Smith thought, though, let's take this and then we'll work toward the other things, because the city fathers again agreed to meet and hash out the other grievances. But it continues to be a problem. Police brutality continues to be a problem. Even when they hire African American police, they're not given the same power as white police officers. And they're also finding sometimes they're picking some African Americans that they'll use to engage in violence against other African Americans. So they will have more protests, and they will demand the resignation of Chief Herring, among other demands. There is lots of nonviolent protests. Predominantly, this is a nonviolent movement, but again, you have some violence. And again, the city fathers try to kill the movement by claiming it's violent. Ultimately, they again make some concessions and eventually do get some police officers hired. However, that continues to be a problem, and one of those police officers, Officer Eaton, who's hired, eventually sues the Hattiesburg Police Department as well, with many other African American officers, to demanding, sues Chief Herring and the city of Hattiesburg, and demands that police have equal power, demands an end to police brutality and so forth, and they eventually win that case. Of course, we know with Black Lives Matter and so forth that all over the nation this is still a major problem. In the Damer case in 1968, they finally make some major arrests, and it is a watershed in this way. It is the first time in the first case they have is Mississippi versus Cecil Sessom, and they get a state conviction by an all-white male jury, which they were actually really surprised to be able to get, for murder. And that's the first time you get a state conviction of a Klansman for murdering a civil rights activist in Mississippi. And so that is really important. But in the other cases, you'll get, two more will get convicted of murder, one will get convicted of arson, and then a bunch, there are not any on the state trials. There are no acquittals. There are some hung juries. There was a lot of Klan tampering with juries. Sam Bowers has tried 3 times, tons of tampering in his juries. He gets away with it until 1998 because the Damers kept at it and eventually brought Sam Bowers to justice in 1998 and got a conviction. On the federal level, this starts to happen when they charge them on the federal level, that those trials happen during desegregation and they actually don't get any convictions and they get some acquittals, unfortunately. And so the last part I want to talk about is desegregation of education. In Hattiesburg, they avoided complying with Brown really until 1970, 54, 16 years later, right? They did that by freedom of choice plan. I put freedom of choice because it's not freedom really. What they're trying to do is say, if African Americans want to come to historically white schools, they can. But they're going to put their names in the paper, their parents' names in the paper, they're going to harass them, they're going to, give African American principals a hard time. If they're in support of it, so that makes it really hard. Anthony Harris, son of Daisy Harris Wade, who was involved in Freedom Summer and many other things, is one of those students. Glenda Funches is another. And they talked about how difficult it was to be an African American young person, in all white schools where, for the most part, they were treated really badly. They were attacked, they were called names, teachers were mean to them, but yet they persevered, right? And both of them were Freedom Summer students. They learned a lot about being an activist, and they had to be an activist to get their education, right? A big protest breaks out because when they were negotiating with city fathers for equal representation, one of the things they started asking for was a school board appointee of an African American. And the city fathers said, okay, as soon as one opens, we don't have any openings, as soon as one opens, we'll get you that. Well, one opens and they give it to a white person. So there's mass protests about that. And Reverend Irvin Grimmett was in the NAACP. I like this quote. "It is tantamount to taxation without representation. It is a detriment to the peace and tranquility about which we have heard so much from City Hall." Because City Hall was always talking about peace and tranquility. Also, students were big in this. Blair and Rowan students in high school did a big walkout to demand that they appoint an African American school board. They also fought against how they were being treated in schools. Some experiences were better. They did talk about some white students that reached across this racial barrier and became good friends and changed a lot of things. Johnny Dupree became mayor here in 2000, was one of these students who was at school and made a lot of white friends at school. So there was some hope there, but a lot of them were facing discrimination. And one of the things that frustrated Rob Woolley, one of the people I interviewed, said, you know, they wanted us to assimilate, not integrate. So, you know, African Americans, if they came over to, you know, faculty and staff, were always like demoted. Like administration would be, you'd be a principal at a black high school, now you're the vice principal at a white high school, right? And you didn't even have the authority that would go with a vice principal. So things like that. And, you know, just culturally and everything, they just wanted them to assimilate into quote-unquote white culture. So that became difficult. But they got a lot of gains with this walkout. They got things like they wanted in their curriculum more education that they were getting in freedom schools about African American history. Peggy G. Connor, who's been really involved in the movement, one of the things they're finding, like I said, suffrage is one thing, but having equal representation is another. And what there's efforts is to always dilute the black vote. Hello? Okay. So always to dilute the black vote. And so, you know, in Hattiesburg, you had a mayor commission form of government then. And so, you know, it was elections like citywide. And so, and the state level, they were always trying to like gerrymander and dilute the black vote. So they had several cases that they launched to make sure that you couldn't dilute the African American vote, and eventually you could get them African American representation, which they eventually are able to do with these cases, and then they are able to elect African Americans, and you know, like Boykins and Deborah Delgado and many other people are finally elected, and then really get to represent the African American voice, and then hopefully also, you know, you see. There is, I should mention, there have been progressive whites and moderate whites in Hattiesburg who have been willing to work, you know, across and fight for civil rights too. As many civil rights activists always argue, right, is really, if, you know, like Dr. King said and others, I mean, unless everyone's free, no one's free. And that we're, you know, really, if we're going to brag about being a country of freedom, equality, and liberty and justice, we have to be that for everybody. And so they were really able to make great changes with that. And so that was my last slide, just to sum up, is that I just think this is one of the most phenomenal movements that I've ever studied. And I teach at Hattiesburg, every time I teach my comparative history class, it's a case study we look at. We look at, like, you know, South Africa and India and, you know, like Israel, Palestine. We look at places all over the world. And I still come back to Hattiesburg as one of the most powerful and amazing movements that I've ever studied. And I just had, you know, really privileged to be here at University of Southern Mississippi with great professors, and in this city with great African American freedom fighters that welcomed me in their home and allowed me to interview them. So I have so many people to be grateful for, and I'm so grateful to the activists because they've made our country a lot better. So thank you.
We have time for a few questions.
Of course, yeah. So any questions?
I just have a statement. I read for the Macklemore Prize a few years ago. You have condensed beautifully what I read in about 6 books.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, though, by the way. Yes, ma'am.
I'm interested in the school desegregation issue, and this is not historical. I'm just wondering if you know what the percentage of basically the academy movement and the percentage of white students in public schools in Hattiesburg now.
I don't know now, because I'm just kind of starting my research on that book. But actually, there was a man who just emailed me. He was a student at one of those schools, and he's done a lot of research. Oh, his name is escaping me, but he wrote an article. I think it was, who is it? Yes, thank you. Stuart Levin wrote a great article published in the Journal of Mississippi History that might have some of those figures that you're looking for. Yeah, because and he talks. He was one, you know, a member of one of those classes, I believe, and talks. It's a really interesting article.
Because it doesn't work in other areas of Mississippi.
The academies.
Well, the academies are going strong in other areas.
Oh, okay.
Public schools are really not desegregated. It's the opposite.
Yeah, I did come across, like, later in the second part of my research, I got through sort of the 80s and 90s. I haven't done a lot of research in the 2000s up. But that, you know, because the academies, then it kind of went back to segregation, basically, right? But more what they've done in the North and the West all these years, like de facto segregation rather than de jure segregation, right? So yeah, I mean, I always think that's so problematic because until we're fully, I think people have always been afraid of integrating, you know, that white supremacists have been afraid of integrating because, you know, kids aren't born, like Nelson Mandela said much better than I'm going to say it, but people aren't born to hate, right? Children aren't born to hate. We're much more naturally to love each other and just, you have to be taught hate. And so, and he argues, if we can be taught hate, we should be able to be, you know, teach love because that's much more natural for humans. But I think like if you don't integrate, you know, if you integrate at a young level, people are going to become friends with people they just like and have, you know, values or whatever, and that'll be across racial borders. But if you keep them apart, then it's easy to keep racism going. So to me, yeah, full integration. I think that we have so many problems because we have segregated neighborhoods, we have segregated, you know, schools, we have segregated, you know, it's not by law, but it's still happening. So until we're fully integrated, I think, you know, I mean, I do remember the end of my book, you always write stuff and you're later like, oh, that was so wrong. That I wrote that I kind of had great hope, right? Because I was finishing, you know, my dissertation and then my book, the era of Obama, when things, you know, I knew that, you know, having an African-American president doesn't mean racism's over, but it was like a hope that things were changing. And I didn't think we had the massive backlash that we now have had in 2016 and so forth. So, you know, but I think the Black Lives Matter movement has been amazing in bringing attention to a lot of the problems that persist. And I know it's a controversial movement, but, you know, it's controversial to fight for rights. So, other questions?
Patricia?
Yes, ma'am. Oh, yes, sir.
One of our hometowns. Were there links, connections with New Orleans, Hattiesburg, activists, protests, or the other side
That's an interesting question. I mean, I certainly read about some activists, you know, because New Orleans is close, that, you know, sometimes came down to work in New Orleans for the summer because you can make better wages sometimes and things like that. In terms of the Klan that Bowers came from was, why is the name of Louisiana escaping me? I live in New Orleans now. It's Bogalusa. It was the Bogalusa Klan. That was a pretty tough Klan in Louisiana. I think that he came from initially. I mean, now that I'm New Orleans, it would be interesting to see more ties, but I don't know a lot of ties. Do you? No, I was curious. If you do, let me know. Yes?
Your view statement about the Hattiesburg City Fathers, is that something intentional, or is that something you kind of found while you were researching?
It is pretty intentional in that really patriarchy and white supremacy I see is pretty linked, right? And
what was the question?
My use of city fathers, why I use that terminology. And actually, when I started using that when I was writing my thesis. Neil McMillan, some of you might know, was my mentor at the time. And he, I kept trying to figure out, you know, because sometimes like you're always going back to a phrase of like what to call them. So that might even have come from him, to be honest. I think somebody should know they're editing your papers. But we had talked a lot about the patriarchy and the racism, and there were no women leaders. There was one judge, actually a woman judge, who was pretty important in enforcing segregation all the time. Judge Mildred Norris, I believe her name was. But it was pretty much the city fathers. So, and they treated it, I use that term a lot too, because they kind of did treat it like this was their town, you know, like, so, yeah, I don't know, maybe an outdated phrase, and maybe I need to rethink it, I don't know, but, yeah.
Would you like to provide a comment about critical race theory?
Yes, actually I would. Well, you know, I will provide a comment about it. I think it is so misunderstood what it even is, first of all. It literally started, because I do a lot of critical feminist theory and critical race theory in what I study. And it started out really, you know, lots of people were doing it. Kimberly Crenshaw is probably the most well-known. But, they were trying to show, she was particularly trying to show how, African American women were being discriminated against because they were black and because they were women, right? And so it was trying to look at institutional structures of racism and to critically analyze it was the idea. That's what Putin wants them to hear. So they're making decisions based on that. So I think often people make decisions and become biased because they're only learning one side of something or propaganda. And so I feel like critical race theory and critical feminist theory, they get at the institutions, they get at things that are harder, that are maybe not as obvious, but when you study it deeply and find where people are not getting promotions because there's bias, racial bias, or not getting hired, or where police systems might be policing this community more than that community, or having stereotypes ingrained in their minds. So when they arrest a white person, they're not coming with the kind of violence when they arrest a black person. So I think critical race theory is able to get at all that, and it's just become an easy buzzword for people that don't want us to talk about race and want to pretend things are better. I mean, I think to all the people that did all the amazing work, yes, things are better. Because to say not, I would say that they didn't do anything, right? I think it's much different. I mean, this university is much different than it was. But are we at the utopia? No, we have a long, long, long way to go, right? I think, and we need to keep talking about it, I feel like. So, does that get it? You're in? Okay, thank you. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Boyett. That was fantastic. And a great way to end, Bo. Thank you for the critical race theory. That's a historian joke. We're all getting those questions right now. So I have a few announcements to make, just to kind of transition us into the sessions. So we are going to have Patricia sign books if you would like to purchase in the back of this room. She will be around to do that and is happy to continue conversations for the next few minutes. Our next session is at 2:30, so you have some time to stretch your legs, take a little bit of a break, and we're going to stay in this building. So those sessions are going to be in classrooms 101/102. Is that the same space?
It's the same space, it's just a larger space.
And which direction? Is it this way?
Yep. Right.
Okay. Thank you, Rebecca. So that will start at 2:30. I hope that you are preparing to transition into session 1 for that. I want to thank the Center for the Study of the Gulf South and the College of Arts and Letters here at University of Southern Mississippi for the luncheon. And something else that you might be interested in, the Millsaps College History Department will be hosting the President's Happy Hour at 5:30 today. I'm not going to say that's going to be my favorite part because there's a lot of cool stuff happening, but I hope to see you there, and I hope that you'll have an opportunity to get to know each other a little bit better during that hour. Right after the happy hour, we will begin our dinner at 6:30, and that session of the conference is going to feature our Book of the Year award winner, Dr. Christian Pennon from Mississippi College. So we will have dinner, and similar to what we just did here, Christian is going to provide our keynote address for the night and talk about his work on Natchez. So that definitely is something to look forward to. If you're planning on joining the downtown Hattiesburg walking tour, which features the history and art, you'll need to sign up for that at the registration table if you haven't already done that. So I do encourage you again to review those opportunities for the tours and make sure that if that's the one that you're interested in tomorrow, that you actually sign up for that. Brother, are there any other things to mention? Okay. Thank you all very much. I will see you in session 1 shortly.